you juxtapose Leo Tolstoy's existential despair with Socrates' embrace of continuous questioning. And I'm wondering if you could perhaps elaborate on how these two figures represent differing responses to, I guess, life's ultimate questions.
In a way, the starting point is what's interesting about them is what they have in common. So I think that, like, if Socrates could talk to anyone in the whole history of the world who was born after him, he might pick Tolstoy, because Tolstoy kind of independently stumbled into the same problem that obsessed Socrates, which is that there are fundamental questions about our lives where we seem to presuppose answers to those questions before we ever raise the question to ourselves. And then the result is that when we try to raise the question, it doesn't feel like it can go anywhere. And for Tolstoy, the discovery of these questions, which are the most important questions, the ones that pertain to the meaning of his life and the point of the various activities in which his life is invested, like educating his children, writing novels, caring about the welfare of the peasants in the sort of area surrounding where he was living, that he didn't really understand why he did any of those things. Like, why am I doing all the things that my life is about? And this drove him into such a despair. And this is at a time in his life, it's worth pointing out, it's a time in Tolstoy's life when he has written War and Peace. He has written Anna Karenina. He is like a hero in Russia. He's an aristocrat. He is by a very long shot the most impressive person that he himself has ever met. He is, he has this huge estate. He has this big, happy family, wife, affairs too. I mean, everything you could want. And he comes to this conclusion that his life is meaningless and that the right course would be to commit suicide, to the point where he has to not leave the house with a gun or hide a rope lest he tie it above the beam and try to hang himself. And Socrates would be so impressed by that, by the fact that Tolstoy took these problems so seriously. But where they part is that Socrates found a way to do something that might seem almost impossible, which is to inquire into a question that he took himself to already have answers to. The way he figured out how to do that is, don't try to do it by yourself. Because if you think about any question that you already think you have an answer to, like what's 2 plus 2, you can't really ask yourself the question, what's 2 plus 2? And you could say the sentence, what's 2 plus 2? And you could try to make your voice sound like it rising at the end, like as though you were asking a question, but you're not really asking a question if you think you already have the answer. You're just pantomiming asking a question. And Socrates is like, but notice you could ask someone else what's 2 plus 2, like a child, say, if you didn't think, you weren't sure they knew the answer. And so what Socrates discovered is that we actually can inquire into these questions that we can't pose to ourselves by inquiring into them with another person, by posing them to another person instead of to ourselves.
You paint the picture of, I believe you call it the Tolstoy Problem, which kind of highlights what I took away is, the dangers of confronting very profound existential questions.
Yes.
So I wondered perhaps if you could elaborate on the Tolstoy Problem.
Yeah. So, what Tolstoy realized sort of in mid-age was that there were these questions that had always been in the corner of his eye ever since he was a young man, like, just what's the meaning of life? What will come of my whole life, given that I'm going to die? That's one of the formulations he gives. And that he had always told himself, later, I'll deal with this later. And it's not going to be very hard. Like, I'm going to be able to do that. For the moment, I got to finish writing Anna Karenina. I got to take care of my kids. I got to work on my house. I got to work on the land. I've got a lot of other things to do, but later, right? He'd been kind of pushing them aside. They'd always been sitting there. And then at a certain point, sort of in midlife, when he is kind of succeeding on all these fronts and maybe doesn't have very active worries on any of them, he kind of turns to face them full on. And he is kind of sucked into this whirlpool of despair because he, as he reports, immediately realizes that he could never make any progress on them. So he has this flip, right? And so the Tolstoy problem is that the most fundamental questions of our lives are these existential questions that it seems we can't make any progress on. And Tolstoy's solution is like, don't look over there. Find a way to look elsewhere. At the end of the day, in a confession, the way that he achieves that is through religious faith. But he is very clear that he would have been better off if he somehow managed never to look at those questions before. He sort of expresses envy for illiterate peasants who just don't have these things even lurking, or maybe they lurk even farther in the background, and so they can more easily look away from them. But yeah.
And of course, it's been very well documented right across the Western world that there's been a mental health epidemic. And I'm curious, to what extent could we, for instance, put down things like Tolstoyan kind of thinking, in the sense that, it's never been easier. There's never been more access to content. There's never been more opportunity. There's probably never been more people questioning, I would perhaps put it, these very deep existential questions. And is it the case that perhaps our inability to handle these questions could be a factor in what is driving such a mental health epidemic?
So I don't know the empirical facts well enough to feel confident that mental health issues have gotten worse, but that's also my experience. Like, if I just tell you about my experience of my world, I have that experience as well. I have worries about how well have we been recording mental health problems throughout history? How much attention have we paid to them in the past? So there's a kind of selection effect question. But in any case, I have that. It corresponds to my experience, whether or not it's a scientific experience. And so there's an interesting thing. William James, in Varieties of Religious Experience, is commenting on Tolstoy and on what's going on with Tolstoy. And he's like, look, I know you're going to think that Tolstoy was just depressed. Maybe you just think, oh, that's why he wanted to kill himself, because he was depressed. And so this, existential quandaries came up. And James says something along the lines of, look, if Tolstoy was depressed, then all of us should be depressed. That is, maybe we're just not brave enough to be depressed in the way he was. And what James means by that is, one way that I would put the point is that it's just fair. It's fair enough to say that this is a mental health issue, but Tolstoy wants to explain to you why he's in this mental health predicament. He thinks it's for a good reason. And if somebody is sad, really sad because their loved one died, you don't call it a mental health issue, right? You're like, okay, they have a reason to be sad. And so this too is a situation where it's like Tolstoy had a reason to be freaked out. And we can call it a mental health issue if we're prepared to call the sadness of the mourner a mental health issue. If we look at the modern situation, I think it's right to say that, regardless of what, let's say, percentage of what gets picked up as mental health comes from this, that this would lead to that, and wealth, in particular wealth, would lead to more people being in this predicament. Why? Because what wealth does is it quiets the bodily command, right? So I talk about in the book these other sources that we have of answers to how we should live. And, we have just really pretty deep and fundamental concerns with staying alive, with securing the lives of the people around us. And when that is under threat, that's what we're going to focus on. And we're just going to sort of presuppose we've got reason to do it. Well, I'll work out the reasons later, kind of like Tolstoy. But when the whole world gets richer, then a lot more people come to be in the position that Tolstoy came to be in his 50s. And all of a sudden we're wondering, wait a minute, what's the point of any of this? I can't postpone it. I can't put it off any longer. I can't somehow claim to myself that there's some more urgent thing that I have to be doing. We just have a lot of leisure time. We're in a world with a lot of leisure time. Not everyone in the world. Okay, there's people in war-torn places. There's people who are struggling with poverty. Those people are probably experiencing less of this. But many of us, those of us who have time to be on and listen to podcasts, have a fair amount of leisure time. And I think that it's right to sort of see that time for the world as a time when philosophy has to prove itself.
As you painted out at the beginning very eloquently, that Tolstoy seemed to be living such a nice life. And I did ask myself, should he have actually started asking himself those questions? I mean,
that's the right question to be asked. So, in a way, my book starts with this sort of contrast, right? Of Tolstoy. I think he's a fair candidate for the most successful human being who ever lived. He should be on anyone's short list. Let's put it that way, right? And this thing, messed him up. And maybe your first pass should be like, yeah, he'd be better off avoiding all this stuff. And the whole rest of the book is an attempt to make the case that that's not the right answer. But I think it's a reasonable first pass at an answer. That is, you need to do a lot of work to give another answer besides that answer. And part of that work is sort of getting you to take Tolstoy's questions seriously. To be like, well, look, if these were just dumb questions or like puzzlers where your brain starts to spin and now you're obsessing over it, like the way a line in a song can get stuck in your head, and it's better not to just listen to the song. If it was that sort of thing, yeah, just don't listen to the song that's going to get stuck in your head. But what I try to do is make the case is not that sort of a thing. And that, in fact, these, but also that we don't actually have to be stuck like wanting to commit suicide at the end of it. That is, there's a way forward. That's part of the case. So yeah, those are both, parts of like me trying to make the case to the contrary. But I think I want to set up the beginning so that the reader is demanding that case.
I'd imagine everybody listening to this assumed the quote, the unexamined life is not worth living. And I guess that this whole kind of point, it really leads to the question that if, for instance, asking these philosophical questions leads us to that greater discomfort, should we still then advocate it? Or is it the case that perhaps it should only then be left to people that perhaps can handle these expeditions, like, for instance, someone like Socrates?
So, I do think Socrates is not committed to the thought that Tolstoy was better off having asked these questions than not having asked them, given that he didn't make any progress on them. Socrates thinks it's worth asking them if you can inquire into them. And so, for instance, if you're in an environment where nobody will inquire with you, you're not better off for having realized that, or at least not necessarily. Maybe only in the sense that, well, maybe you could look for such a person. I think if you sort of ask about Tolstoy, it's a little complicated because this crisis also figures so centrally in his writing. So in everything, there's a moment like this. There's a Tolstoy confession crisis in War and Peace. There's one in Anna Karenina. It forms all of Death of Ivan Ilyich. There are versions of it in others of his short stories, not as perfect as those three, but there's a way in which this crisis is kind of played an important role in Tolstoy's fiction, actually, even before he sort of recognized it. He was telling this story. He has, in War and Peace, again, written well before the crisis, he has this wonderful line about Pierre, where Pierre, realizes these questions and is doesn't know how to answer them. And he said it was like there was a screw in his brain that was stripped, and he kept trying to turn the screw, but it didn't go anywhere. And that's what the question was like. What is the meaning of my life? Just turning that stripped screw. So that was a wonderful description. And so Tolstoy, I think, actually did manage to do something with this. Like, he managed to do something creative and positive. And, like, Death of Ivan Ilyich is one of the great things written by any human being, like maybe greater than War and Peace and Anna Karenina. I love them all, but and it's just a full frontal view of this problem. And so, was it good or bad for Tolstoy? Well, how much do you like Death of Ivan Ilyich?
Well, one of the kind of the points that this got me thinking of, and I do feel like this point has very significant implications. And we recently hosted Robert Sapolsky, the brilliant Stanford professor, on the show. And he was talking on the show that he started wrestling with these questions when he was 13, and it led to him basically ending up in a deep depression. At 13, he'd basically come to quite significant answers about God, about the meaning of life. He stated on the show that he came to the conclusion at 13 years old that we had no free will. And he stated that he ended up falling into a really deep depression. And in my own life, I would say that I'm a reasonably neurotic person. And I, for a long time, I was journaling and I was doing all these things. And I found that, in fact, it was actually making me worse. I didn't find that it was really having any benefit to me. I found the constant self-examination, I found that I was just perhaps better off without it. And I'm just curious, perhaps, what you think of just those two examples, and perhaps what would be a case for the opposite for that exam in life.
So here's something that your story and Sapolsky's story and Tolstoy's story have in common. It
I
sounds
love
like
it.
you all tried to do something by yourself. So you were writing in a
Mm.
journal, right? He was like pondering to himself. Um, I've never heard a version of this story where someone says, "Look, I had this absolutely miserable plunge into an existential despair of philosophy, which I was entirely conducting conversationally with my friends." Right. So all of my explorations in philosophy were conversations with my friends, but it threw me into an existential despair. That doesn't throw people into existential despair. Why not? Because you actually make progress and it works and you get somewhere and it's worthwhile and you enjoy it. So in effect, I think you were just demonstrating the thesis of my book, which is there's something you can't do by yourself. When you try, things don't get better. You just plunge yourself deeper into the despair of trying to, get somewhere with materials that can't get you there. It's exactly what happens to Tolstoy. And so, like, what's the case for the other thing? The best case for it is actually to do it and to see that it works, right? But the second best case is to watch it. And that's what Plato gave you. So he gave you a bunch of dialogues in which you have Socrates and you have some other guy, and they're exploring some fundamental question about the meaning of life. Like, what is it to be a good person? Like, what is virtue? And you watch them, and it's not always pleasant. I mean, they can get into little altercations. The other guy can be annoyed that Socrates keeps refuting him. But by the end of it, like the conversation has moved, and there's some theories on the table, and there's some ways of processing the concepts that are now in like a clear and more, like the territory has been delineated a bit better, and you can sort of see that like there's been intellectual progress over the course of this conversation, because you can feel the intellectual progress in yourself from just having read it. And that's the case. That's the best case for a philosophical life, is either to live it or to read it being lived.
What is it in terms of that social element of having people to perhaps untangle your thought process in real life that is far more effective, and it's a shame perhaps that Robert Sapolsky at the time didn't have someone to to do that with. Yeah, same for myself. Why? What is it about that kind of that social soundboarding that is a kind of a moderator of that effect?
Yeah, so I'll note that this was happening to him at 13. It's a little young, but I do think that the teenage years are the most naturally philosophical years of a person's life. That is, teenagers naturally gravitate to philosophy, usually to Nietzsche. For some reason, that's me too. I read Nietzsche as a teenager. In fact, I read Hermann Hesse, which is like kind of the novelist watered down version of Nietzsche. But and I would say here's one fact about teenagers: they're naturally philosophical, because there's this period of your life where you don't quite have to do anything yet, right? And so you have a bit of leisure, but you're also an adult. And at some point, you're going to move on to like, okay, now I need to be in school and do this and get a job and whatever. But there's this little window when you're already an adult, but you're not yet having to do anything. Okay, so you become philosophical in that period. Also, that's a period where people become intensely social and form these really tight connections. Sometimes they're romantic, but typically often they're not. They form like a social circle, a group, and what do they do together? They talk. Right? That's what their bonding, that's what their closeness is. Sometimes it involves alcohol, sometimes it involves music, but a lot of times the alcohol and the music are sort of there as to set the stage for a certain kind of bonding of like, these are the people I can really talk to. Right. So this is just to say, I think that like we really do need other people. There's stuff we can't do for ourselves. Now, why? So in my book, fully a third of my book, slightly more than a third, is devoted to answering that question. It's the hardest part of the book. It's the middle part of the book. And I give a couple of different reasons, but let me maybe start with this one. I take to be kind of, I don't know, it's not the simplest one, but it's maybe for me the most profound one, which is that when we're trying to make progress on an inquiry, and we want to know what to believe, and we're not sure what to believe, we have two goals. One of our goals is that we want to have true beliefs. That is, we want to have truth. And the other one is we want to avoid having false beliefs. And you might think, wait, you just did the same thing twice. I mean, obviously, if you want to have truth, you want to avoid falsehoods. They sound like the same, but they're not the same. The reason they're not the same, so like, suppose that I've come to believe something. And I suppose that the thing that I've come to believe is true. Then I've satisfied both of these requirements. I have a truth and I've avoided the falsehood. I've avoided believing the other thing, whatever that other thing was. So retrospectively, they come together, but prospectively, they don't. Suppose I haven't yet come to believe it. I'm not sure what I should believe about this thing, right? Let's say, here's an example I give in the book. Does honey spoil? Okay. Does honey spoil or not? Suppose I want to have a belief about that one way or the other. Suppose I want to avoid falsehood. Well, then, since I'm not sure one way or the other, I should just suspend judgment. I should just not have a belief at all. Then I can be sure that I've satisfied the rule avoid falsehood, right? I know I don't believe anything false if I don't believe anything at all. But suppose I'm like, no, I want to at least a shot at a true belief. Well, then just believe one or the other. I mean, just guess. You at least have a 50% chance of having it. So following the rule, have truths, puts you in the mode of being credulous, of just risk it, just chance it. You need to believe something in order to live your life. You're going to need some beliefs to lean on, and just have as many beliefs as possible, and then you'll have as many truths as possible. You'll also have a bunch of falsehoods, but look, your goal is to have truths, just believe. But if your goal is to avoid falsehood, if you're like, no, I will never, ever allow anything into the sanctity of my mind unless it is with the most certain evidence, then what you're going to have to do is be skeptical, okay? Withhold, don't assent. Now, the problem is that when you're inquiring into anything, about the meaning of life, anything at all, you really kind of need to follow both these rules. That is, it's really, really important that you're following the rule of having truths and you're following the rule of avoiding falsehoods. And you're not going to get anywhere unless you follow both. But you can't follow both because they pull you in two different directions. Those are two different personality types, the skeptical and the credulous. You can't be both skeptical and credulous at the same time. And what Socrates discovered is one person can't, but two people can, because one of them can be skeptical and the other one can be credulous. And so what's happening in a conversation is that you're playing these different roles. And one person is giving answers and the other person's like, wait, there's something I didn't get about that. Or, oh, I have a question about that. Or and the job of the first one is just give some answer. Just guess if you have to, but say something so that we can examine it. Your job is to have a truth. Your job is to be credulous. And then the other person's be very careful. Do not accept what they say. Be inclined to reject it. And Socrates noticed that if these two people work together, they can inquire. But a single person by themselves will be stuck. They would be stuck either dogmatizing to themselves about a bunch of truths or just pulled into a skeptical whirlpool about how do I ever know anything?
I thought that was really beautifully said. And I think that really ties us nicely onto kind of Socratic inquiry. First of all, I wonder perhaps before we could jump into it, I wonder if you could perhaps just paint a picture of, I guess, how did Socrates become as big as he is that, if you go right up to now that you and I were having a discussion about him all these many years later, what is there about him specifically that has, transcended generations? Why was he such an important figure?
And maybe the first thing to just make clear is really that he was so important, and in particular, that after he died. So after Socrates died, a very weird thing happened, which is that people started writing in this new genre that they created just for him, namely the Socratic dialogue. So people would write these little plays of Socrates talking to some other guy. And it would be different other guys in different versions of these plays. And I mean, imagine being the kind of person who, as soon as you die, everybody starts trying to resuscitate you, basically, by writing these conversations of you talking to this guy, you talking to that guy, you talking to someone you couldn't possibly have met, right? People are just writing these things. Most of them didn't survive. Most stuff written in the ancient world didn't survive, sadly. But two of them survived. We know about lots of other ones, so we know these things existed. But Plato's dialogue survived and Xenophon survived. So we have at least two. We also have another really interesting text from more direct contemporary. We have Aristophanes' Clouds, which shows us that even during his lifetime, Socrates was so significant that somebody would write a comic play making fun of him, which is what the Clouds is. Okay, but the Socratic dialogues are sort of they attest to the fact that Socrates made this really big impression on the people around him. That impression was not wholly positive because Athens voted to put him to death, but I would say it was a high variance reaction, right? So for some people, it was really strongly negative, but for another set of people, it was so positive that it inspired them to create this new genre, in effect to make sure the world doesn't forget Socrates, is a way to think about what Plato was doing, what Xenophon was doing, what some of these other guys were doing. And I think that I'm not sure that they were all totally clear on why is it so important that we remember Socrates. But if you look at what happens in the next period, okay, after Aristotle's sort of taking up the Platonic line of thought, but also lots of other intellectual currents at the time, including Socrates, you get the Hellenistic period, and you get sort of the birth of philosophical schools. So, there's Plato's Academy, there's Aristotle and the Peripatetics, there are the Stoics, there are the Cynics, there are the Epicureans. So you get this world. The skeptics, we don't want to forget skeptics because they, you get this world of little intellectual communities. And most of them treat Socrates as their figurehead. That is, they say, we are the Socrates school. They think very different things, but they all think we're doing the Socrates thing. Not the Epicureans. Epicureans were the one group who were like, we're not doing what Socrates did. But still, this very thing, like an intellectual community where people get together and talk about their ideas and explain how they're different from other people's ideas, is that too is a continuation of Socrates, right? And it's like that we owe him something that fundamental. Is I think what we have to reckon with. It's like at that point you start to see, okay, I get why we keep on remembering this guy.
And I wonder if you could perhaps, for the person listening now, and we've touched on it a little bit, but in terms of the actual process of Socratic inquiry, I wonder if you could perhaps just give us just a high level overview of what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the way that it generally works in the dialogues is there's like a little bit of small talk, and then Socrates asks someone a question. And the first thing to note is it's not just any old question. It's one of these sort of fundamental questions that we were talking about earlier with Tolstoy, but it's selected in a special way. It's selected to be the fundamental question that is geared toward that person's life, the person that he's talking to, right? So if he's talking to a general, he might ask them, what is courage? If he's talking to an orator, he might ask them, what is oratory? If he is talking to a child, he might ask them, do your parents really love you, Lysis? He does ask. If he's talking to like a kind of heartthrob, he might ask them, what is moderation, i.e. sexual moderation? If he's talking to a really ambitious person, he will say, what does it actually take to rule, to be worthy of rule? Something like that. Okay, so he picks these questions by kind of noticing what is going to have that kind of status for that person. You could ask me, what is courage? And I do happen to care about that question, right? But I'm not like, my career isn't invested in the answer to that question in a way that if I was a general, maybe it would be, because it's about military courage in that particular concept. Well, originally it is. And then they're supposed to give him an answer. They're supposed to tell him what the thing is. And generally they're able to say something. It's often an example what they offer. Euthyphro, who's asked, what is piety, says, oh, it's the thing I'm about to do, prosecuting your father. And Socrates is like, okay, but I want the general account. I want to know what is the general account of piety such that the thing that you're about to do, prosecuting your father, which looks for all the world like the opposite of piety. Euthyphro's father Euthyphro is prosecuting his own father for the murder of a servant who killed a slave. And Euthyphro said the father didn't murder him. He put him in a pit and waited for religious advice as to what he should do with him, but he didn't give him any food while he was in the pit. And so the guy died. And so Euthyphro is prosecuting his own father for this weird death. Okay. And Socrates is like, is that pious? Because respecting your parents is like one of the fundamental principles of piety, okay, in this world. And so you can't just give that as an example, what, like my father, prosecuting your father, prosecuting the wrongdoer. And then they try like a different answer. They try, piety is what the gods love. And Socrates is like, wait, do they all agree? Because I heard that sometimes, like, Zeus and his father Kronos might feel differently about the question, is it okay to castrate your father? Because Zeus castrated his own father, but maybe Kronos doesn't agree about whether that's pious or not. And so then Euthyphro tries, okay, it's whatever all the gods love. If there are any actions that all the gods love, and the thing I'm doing is all the gods love it. And then Socrates is like, well, do they love it because it's pious, or is it pious because they love it? And then Euthyphro was like, I don't understand. Is it not the same thing? And it's actually, no, this is actually a really important difference. Okay. The difference is there like a property of piety that some actions have that gods are able to notice that property and then they love it once they notice that an action has it? Or do we just use the word pious for whatever the gods happen to love? And so in effect, what comes first is that they have arbitrary loving of things. Those things may have nothing in common intrinsically, and we just call all those things pious. You may recognize this question from its modern variant. Is something moral because it's socially acceptable, or is it socially acceptable because it's moral? Right? That is morality just an elaborate way we have of talking to whatever society wants you to do, or does society want you to do the things it wants you to do because they independently have this property, morality?
Yeah.
So it's a pretty deep and important question. And notice we got to it pretty quickly in a conversation that's only like 20 pages long. So just to show you, this started out with, okay, what is piety? Try to define it. Don't just give me examples. And through like a few iterations, we got to, okay, there's some really important questions about basically whether like our ethical concepts are sort of objective or not, that we have gotten to. So it keeps going, but I won't summarize the whole dialogue. But what happens is that Socrates is sort of examining these answers, and as he's examining them, we get pulled into various sorts of philosophical problems.
And how is this typically used in kind of day-to-day life? Because I can imagine it being applicable in things like, say, psychotherapy.
Yeah. So I think psychotherapy has a lot in common with a Socratic inquiry. I'll tell you what I think the biggest difference is. So I think psychotherapy often involves like questions and hard questions that are uncomfortable, questions a person doesn't want to answer, and then they feel like they make progress by answering the questions. The biggest difference is that in psychotherapy, there is one set of desires that are relevant for the therapeutic interaction, which is the patient's desires. That is, the patient has some problem in their life, and they're going into therapy because they want to make headway on that problem. And there are things they want to know about themselves, maybe, things that they want to change. And what the therapist wants to know is irrelevant, right? So maybe the therapist is curious how you related to your mom. They're not allowed to ask you about that if they're just curious about it. They're allowed to ask you if they think it serves your desire to like know something about yourself or improve this condition or whatever. The therapist has to sideline themselves. They have to sideline their own interests. They have to sideline their own desire to know and become kind of an instrument of the patient's process of self-improvement. And so there's a weird way in which in therapy, there's only one person in the room. And now it depends on the kind of therapy. Interestingly, a lot I've actually talked to over the course of sort of promoting this book. I've talked to a number of different therapists, and I found, to my surprise, all of them identify as Socratic. So the psychoanalytic, psychodynamic people, and like the cognitive behavioral therapy people, they're all like, we're kind of like Socrates, and I think they kind of are. So that's fair enough. But I'm like, but the difference is that, in therapy, there's only one person in the room in some sense. Whereas in Socratic interaction, there's two people who both have desires, who both have things they want to know. They're both legitimate. And that's really important. The little bit of caveat here is transference in psychoanalytic. The psychoanalytic approach sort of allows the analyst's desires to come on the scene, but really only to find another way of sidelining them, right? The point of mentioning countertransference is what I meant to say, the analyst countertransference. The point of mentioning is that you have to learn to not let it get in the way of your therapizing. You have to kind of, not allow, the whole point is of discussing countertransference is to say that the analyst has to take care not to let their own unanalyzed psychological conflicts, traumas, etc., interfere with their production of therapy. Whereas from Socrates' point of view, no, you got to put it all on the table.
I wonder, perhaps people might be thinking that if this relentless inquiry that is kind of demanded by this kind of mode of being, this kind of questioning, is that incompatible with things like commitments to things like causes, whether relationships, institutions, and is there a point in which that inquiry becomes self-defeating?
Good. Okay. Causes, relationship, institutions. Good. So Socrates takes this point up in a number of different places because he gets accused of this and he thinks it's wrong. So I think on the one hand, he is very willing to say, look, the only thing I'm really committed to is the argument. Everything else I'm willing to let go. And then you might say, well, that's just not very committed then, Socrates. And he's like, actually, that's the best way to be committed to anything. It's the best way to be committed to in a romantic relationship is to be committed to the argument. That's sort of what I try to work through in my love chapter. And he's like, here's why. When you look at so Socrates' idea is that in a relationship with Alcibiades, in a relationship with Crito, to say he's committed to the argument is to say that he's committed to working through together with them how to live and never giving up on that. That is, for the rest of our lives, let's just figure out how to live together. And he wants to say that's what it is to really be committed to a relationship. And if I look instead at Alcibiades' behavior, because he's consumed with jealousy that Socrates may have romantic interests in other men, he ends up being very fickle, right? Running off and doing other things and then being pulled back into Socrates and behaving crazy. And Socrates is like, I don't do any of that. I'm just here ready to talk to Alcibiades whenever he's willing to. So Alcibiades has the traditional form of commitment, which is the kind where the kind of romantic commitment where you get burned up with jealousy and you get revenge and you do all this other stuff. And it's not actually very committal. My kind is actually more committal. Causes. So Socrates says, here's the thing I've noticed about causes is that, they will occasionally, but reliably drive people to do terrible things that go against the original cause. And no, I'm not willing to stick to something at that point. And in a way, the problem with causes is that they induce a kind of overcommitment to something that isn't the cause. And so, if your commitment is to a better world and you're creating a revolution because you want a better world, but then you're willing to slaughter lots of people for the sake of your revolution because you're really committed, what you're committed to isn't a better world anymore. It's something else, you have a bunch of allies and you want to stick to them even when they're doing something bad. And Socrates is like, I don't do that. I stay committed to my causes. My causes are things like justice, liberty, and equality, and I will be committed to those things, for the long run. But justice, liberty, and equality might require me to join different groups at different times, whoever is promoting those things. Institutions. I think that this is one where we don't have a lot of text to go on, but maybe we can think of Athens and the government of Athens as an institution. And this comes up in the Crito, where Socrates is offered a chance to run away because he's in jail and he's about to be executed. And Crito's like, I can bribe the jailer and we can get out and you don't have to die. And please, let's do this right now because you're about to be killed. So we got to make this decision really fast. And Socrates is like, no, I am inside of a certain institution, namely the government of Athens. And I believe in that institution. And I don't believe in just breaking its rules. And this is an institution that I'm committed to, that I could have left this city. I could have lived a different kind of life, but I wanted to live here. And, Athens has offered me opportunities to try to persuade it that I'm right. And I did use those opportunities. I made a speech of self-defense at my trial. And I'm sort of committed to this institution and not going to allow myself to try to harm it. And so I think that what those are supposed to be illustrations of is that a philosophical commitment that is at bottom only a commitment to the argument is actually a pretty good commitment to other people, causes, and institutions.
You and I now, we're discussing Socrates. Everybody knows who he is. Everybody discusses his quotes. There's kind of an inspirational aura around him. Of course, one of the things about him, which is a contrast, this is, of course, that his life ended in execution. If we do embrace a kind of a mode of thinking, a mode of inquiry, which may be, pure in intention, but it puts us at odds with the world, with the society around us, to the point where, for instance, in Socrates' case, which did lead to him being accused of corrupting the youth. In that sense, is a Socratic life an inherently tragic one? Is it one that we should aspire to?
So I think I think Plato definitely asked himself that question. And the evidence for that is that in the Apology, when Socrates is giving his speech of self-defense at his trial, Plato has him sort of tell the story of his life in a way that, to the Greek reader of the text, is going to be extremely familiar, reminiscent of a different story. So the story that Plato has Socrates tell is, I was just hanging out. I was just an ordinary guy, minding my own way. My friend Chaerephon went to this oracle. And he asked this oracle a question, and then it gave him an answer. And the answer was just unbelievable to me. So I set out to refute the answer. And that kind of attempt to sort of fight the oracle and refute it, sort of dominated my life and made me to the person that I am. Okay, so the audience would hear the story of Oedipus here. Right, a guy who was a regular guy until he went to an oracle. The oracle told him something he couldn't believe. He tried to fight the oracle by saying, the oracle said, you're going to kill your father, marry your mother. And Oedipus is like, no way in hell I'm doing that. I'm going to go run away from home, make sure I never see my father and mother again. On the way, he ends up killing his father at a crossroads. Then he ends up going to this new town, Thebes, and finding who, unbeknownst to him, was actually his mother, marrying her because they received an oracle earlier saying their son's going to kill whatever, and they sent their kid away. Okay. And so Socrates is like, look, my story fits like a tragic formula in a way, right? But then the point is, but it's not tragic. Mine didn't end up tragic. That is, I was in a predicament that could have landed me in tragedy, but I resolved it in a non-tragic way. So the first thing to notice here is that what Plato is saying is like, look, this idea that we might be at odds with the world around us in a tragic way, that's actually the human predicament. That's not the philosopher's predicament. That's what all the tragedians try to tell you, is that anyone could be Oedipus, right? Anyone could end up in a tragic situation, unbeknownst to themselves. They're just doing their best. They're just doing their thing, going through their lives, trying to take reasonable measures to improve their life, pursue the good, avoid the bad, and they end up in a total disaster. It's what happens to Oedipus. It's what happens to Cleon and Antigone. It's what happens to Antigone and Antigone. It's what happens to Medea. It's what happens to everyone in every tragedy. Life is tragic. Okay, that's what the tragedians want to tell us. Life is essentially, fundamentally tragic. Maybe you're not going to notice it in your life because you get so lucky that you don't, stumble into one of these scenarios, but probably you're going to stumble into a few of them. And in fact, what Plato tries to tell us is that the philosopher is the non-tragic one. The philosopher is the one who navigates this tragic predicament in a non-tragic way. Now, what is the non-tragic way? Well, it's what they do in response to the oracle. So both Oedipus and Socrates get this oracular answer. Both of them find the answer incredible. What does Oedipus do? Well, Oedipus is very sure that he knows exactly what the oracle means. The oracle means he's going to kill Polybus and marry Merope. Okay, Polybus and Merope are the people who raised him. This is true, even though the reason Oedipus originally went to the oracle is that he was at a bar having a drink, and some guy next to him says, you don't actually know who your parents are. And he goes to his parents and he's like, wait, is there something I don't know? And they're like, no, it's fine, Oedipus. We're your parents, it's all good. And he's worried about it. So he goes to an oracle and he's like, are my parents my parents? And the oracle's like, you will kill your father and marry your mother. And Oedipus got to run away from Polybus and Merope. He forgets his question. His question was, are they my parents, right? And he did not get an answer, and he got a different thing, and he assumed he had an answer, and that was where he screwed up. And now Socrates, the oracle says, nobody's wiser than Socrates. And Socrates is like, what does it mean? That's his response. What does that mean? Okay, how many of us, let's say, Socrates was in a Harry Potter situation. The Harry Potter situation is you're going along minding your own business. And then you get a little message down the chimney that says, you're special, you're different, you're better than other people, you have super magical powers. He got that and he's like, that's not true. That can't be right. Which is very extraordinary, right? But he doesn't say, but the oracle's not allowed to lie, so it can't be a lie. But I can't see it as true, so what I have to do, I have to investigate it. I have to try to understand what the oracle means by inquiring into it. So what Plato is saying is that you can avoid tragedy by living an inquisitive life. That is, you can live a life where you're not, as you're going through your life, always assuming that you know what's up and you know what's good and you know how to proceed, and Because in that situation, when you actually don't, you're vulnerable to having the rug pulled out from under you in the way that Oedipus does. Socrates never gets the rug pulled out from under him. Socrates does not think that when he is put to death by the Athenians, that anything bad has happened to him. Why? Well, for one thing, he's 70 years old, right? That a remarkable thing about Socrates is how long he wasn't put to death for. I mean, he got to 70 doing this, so he's actually pretty good at not getting himself put to death for it. But the other part is like he's like, I don't know if death is an evil. That's something you guys are all walking around assuming, even though no one's ever made an argument for it or even given you reasons why. I don't know what's going to happen when I die. For all I know, maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it's just an eternal sleep, and that's fine. But one thing I'm not going to do is walk around assuming I know a bunch of stuff that I don't know, because that's what lands you in tragedy.
So one of the things I think, obviously, when I was preparing for this, and I was kind of, reading about your story, obviously going through the book, and I'm interested, kind of, I would say, perhaps in maybe a personal application of this, in the sense that, of course, your personal life, your family dynamics has been a subject of, for instance, of much public interest. And I'm wondering, in those cases, did, for instance, Socratic principles, did they, for instance, influence, any personal decisions that you made in that area?
I think that I use Socratic principles in making all of my personal decisions. I think it's a way to make personal decisions. So, basically, the way it works is, like, let's say you come to the conclusion that you should get divorced. This is a conclusion I came to. Right? And I'm like, what you realize if you're Socratic is like, well, I don't actually know that that's right. That is, there's one person who can help me figure out whether that's right or not, and that's the person I'm getting divorced from. And either we can agree together about this, or we got to keep talking. And so that's how I approached getting a divorce. And in fact, the initial response was, there was a stage of the game where I was pretty persuaded by the thought, maybe we should go into therapy or try to rehabilitate this or whatever. And I was like, okay, if that's where we are. And then, we talked further, and then we became convinced, no, we actually have to get divorced. And so the thought is like, whether or not I should get divorced is simply not something I am able to figure out on my own. If I'm a Socratic, that is. What I can do is I can have certain images and fantasies and tell certain stories and put narratives about myself, but none of that's real until I can make the case to someone else and we can see it the same way. And in particular, the person who is involved in it. But that's the same with parenting. If I want to restrict my kids' video game time, which I constantly want to do. It's like a series of conversations of what are you doing with the computer and why is it good? What is the good you're getting out of it? And because maybe I'm wrong, maybe they are getting something out. And sometimes I am wrong, actually, and they are really getting something valuable, and they can convince me of it. No, I'm using I'm interested in architecture when my kids is, and I'm using the software to design buildings, and this is how I'm going to progress my interest in architecture. And then sometimes they're like, look, this is how I socialize with my friends because they are also all in video games. And this is our social arena or whatever. But they have to make the case to me. That is, they don't just get to decide by themselves. Not because I don't believe that they should have autonomy because they're just kids, but because I believe no human being should have autonomy because nobody knows what they should do. And so it's not as kids, but as humans that we have to have a conversation about how you should live your life because you're not capable of figuring that out on your own.
And to highlight this point, and please fact check me if I'm wrong, I really don't want to overstep the mark or be inaccurate. But is it the case that, for instance, you, your partner, and your ex-husband, you all kind of share the same house? Is that
yes,
what the situation
together, that's correct.
Amazing. And I'm just curious, if you don't mind me asking, how did obviously you mentioned you had very open and honest dialogues. What was the kind of the decision making process there?
So we didn't all initially live together.
Okay.
That is after we got divorced. I moved out, and the conversation started when I was pregnant with my third kid, which is my kid with my current husband, and I have two kids with my ex-husband. And at the time, this is important background, is we were all on good terms, and we would regularly all have dinner together anyway. I think that we all came to the view that it would be pretty important for the three boys to grow up as brothers. And that the only real way to do that was for them to grow up in the same house. And this particularly from the point of view of the youngest child, right? Because the other two have a brother already, but he's coming into this world on his own. And I'm very much someone who believes that like the greatest gift you can give your children is siblings, because they're going to be around when you die. And so, it's only a consideration. It's not necessarily a decisive consideration. Had we not gotten along, we wouldn't have done this. But given that we got along, the value that we could give our kids by sort of allowing them to grow up fully as brothers was something that we thought was a strong enough reason to try to make it work. And it was experimental. We're like, let's see if it works or not. And then it did. So we stuck with it.
I've got just two more audience questions left that I'd love to ask you before I ask you to sign off and tell these guys where they can connect with you and where they can get the book, and we'll send them anywhere that you'd like. So just two general questions that come in from our audience. Who do you consider to be the most influential modern day philosopher of our times?
By modern day, if we're saying somebody who's alive right now,
I think that's what's implied. Yeah, someone's still alive.
I think it's going to be a toss-up between Peter Singer and Martha Nussbaum. I think Peter Singer is a very big deal because he has made utilitarianism kind of concrete and available and accessible as a philosophical outlook for many people. And then that's been like taken up in kind of policy ways in the sort of effective altruism community and in kind of the broader rationalist utilitarian world. And I think Martha has sort of done some of that for like Aristotelian virtue ethics. That is, and sort of more broadly, she has, as a philosopher, ventured out into topics about animal rights and liberal arts education and the emotions, and into literary texts in ways that sort of show the power of philosophy. And all throughout her work, there is a kind of attunement to the fragility, the vulnerability, but like the preciousness of human beings and human existence. Also, more recently, the preciousness of non-human animals and stuff, I should say. But sort of resisting any quick reduction, and yet still able to like speak in a compelling way to a broad audience. So yeah, I would name the two of them.
And if someone wanted to know what would be three philosophical books that most deeply impacted your life, what would they be?
I'll give you the first answer, which is kind of a cheap answer, which is just Plato's whole corpus, obviously. But in particular, the Socratic dialogues. There's a particular text called The Five Dialogues. It's published by Hackett. You can buy the whole complete Plato. Okay, I have it right here. But there's Five Dialogues. It costs like $5, right? It's the 5 best dialogues. It's amazing, most amazing deal. Way better deal than my book, I got to say. These are the books that have influenced me the most. But let me not say Plato, since that's kind of a little bit giving an obvious answer. Kant's groundwork was a huge influence. It's what turned me on to philosophy. It sort of created for me this, like, I don't know, beautiful image of what philosophy could do. It could attune you to like what's really valuable: human dignity, the will that shines like a jewel against even the blackness of human inclinations. What else? Hobbes's Leviathan was a pretty big impact on me, but I have not reread it in a long time, so I feel like a poser of myself citing it because I haven't reread it in like 15 years. Of stuff that I have reread recently, Descartes' Meditations. I think, it is the strongest anti-Socratic case. No, the mind can work on itself, all by itself. You can just go alone in a stove-heated room and just sit there by yourself and examine your own thoughts and make progress. So that's, the biggest case against Socrates is Descartes' Meditations. And let me pick one more. Okay, this is a total oddball pick, but like rather than just listing classic works of philosophy, because like you already know what those are, I'm just going to give you a work that has had a huge impact on me in the past like 6 months. And it's not in philosophy, but it's very philosophical, and it's totally obscure, unless you're a sociologist. It's called Lectures on Conversation by Harvey Sachs. And Harvey Sachs is a sociologist who died tragically young. And basically, what he does is he kind of gives you these little snippets of conversation, and he shows you what lies behind a conversation and all the tiny little ways in which we are guiding each other in a conversation, which is so important to me because I'm trying to understand, like, how do we make room for philosophy in conversation? And I think he's showing you like the structure that's there. And so that's it's not a book that turned me into a philosopher, but it's a book that has made a huge impact on me lately.
I love it. I love it. Agnes, tell these guys where they can connect with you, where they can get the book, and where else would you love our audience to check out?
You can buy the book on, Amazon, US Amazon, UK Amazon, at your local bookstore probably. I found it in an airport bookstore recently. I was so excited. So, you might just find it in your local bookstore. Um, you can find me on Twitter at Agnes Callard, and I also have a Blue Sky account, and I have a Substack account. I think they're roughly that. I don't check those as often. I don't have a website yet. I keep saying I'm going to make one. I've been saying that for 5 years, but maybe someday it will actually happen. But you can just Google me, and you'll find whatever I've been doing most recently.
Well, we will link to everything below. And I just want to say this has been such a pleasure. It's been a real privilege speaking to you. I loved your passion. I love the depth and the clarity of your thought. And it was a pleasure reading your book. It was a privilege getting to speak to you. And I would, again, love to do it someday. And we'll link to everything below that we discussed today.
Thank you so much. It was very nice to talk to you too.